Making Comics 101, issue 19, Colors. Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome, mad creators, to the underground laboratory where together we're going to create some awesome comics, because this is Making Comics 101, issue number 19. Man, we're getting close to the finish line here with this series. But anyway, issue 19, today we're talking about colors. Now, this is something that I have some experience with, but not a lot. So I'll try to do my best. You know, my books, if you've seen any of my books, most of them are in black and white. I do a lot of color work outside of comics, but within the world of comics, I pretty much stick to black and white other than covers and things like that. Nevertheless, I'm gonna give you as much information as I can, and hopefully this will help you guys out if you are looking to do a comic in color. So where do we begin? Well, first let's talk about some of the tools. Now, we can break those tools down into, you know, digital and analog. I think with this one, and I try to keep it, I do try to keep that pretty level as far as talking about both digital and analog. It seems like nowadays, I think people that work even traditionally as pencilers or inkers, a lot of times still when they go to colors, it's digital. I know that's the case for me. I'm starting to switch more to digital for most things. But even when I do traditional pencils and inks, I have always, since computers were at a point where we can do this kind of stuff back in the 90s, I've always, done my colors digitally when I do colors. And even when I do grayscale, I still use the computer for that for the most part. But like I said, I've worked in all kinds of different mediums, and other artists do as well, so we will touch on some of that. But first I want to touch on just the digital tools. So as far as digital tools go, there's a number of different apps and software that you can use. Probably Photoshop is the most widely used, and obviously there's other like free kind of alternatives to Photoshop, which a lot of people use that don't want to invest in Photoshop. I've always used Photoshop, even though now when I do my comics digitally, I use Clip Studio Paint, and Clip Studio Paint can do great with colors. I learned how to do it in Photoshop, so I kind of stick with that. But also Clip Studio Paint, in addition to Photoshop, a lot of people are using Procreate on the iPad Pro to color their comics. I recently purchased Affinity Designer, which is something that's been coming more in vogue. I think Infinity Photo, another software that they have, is probably, I'm guessing, better for coloring. I think it's more like Photoshop, but those are alternatives. They're a lot less expensive than Photoshop, but still pretty robust and everything. But whatever program you use, there's some things that you want to take into consideration when coloring a comic book. All of the software that I mentioned, they do support layers, and they have different, filters and effects. I would advise you to go sparingly on some of those, especially all the effects, because you'll notice, and we'll get into this, but back when in the 90s, when you look at some of those early 90s comics, when this whole new world of color, digital coloring opened up, people were just going crazy using every single thing, because it's like you give somebody this toolbox with all of these new tools, and it's just like, oh, I want to use this and this and this and this. So, but you got to hold back on some of that. There's awesome tools that are really good for certain things, but you don't want to overuse those. Same thing with the layers. You can get really crazy with the layers, but I would try to keep them organized. I mean, back when people were working, traditionally with just paint and everything, they didn't have that option for layers. They had to basically, they start at one point and they build up on that. In the grand scheme of things, it's all up to you. You have to do things the way you want, and I will get into sort of my process with coloring on a bonus issue. Today, I'm just putting more information out there, talking about some of the different tools and different techniques and all that stuff. We'll get into all that, but we will dive a little deeper, and I'll show you sort of my process. And with this, I'll say right at the bat, as far as coloring, there are so many different ways to go about coloring. Like I said, just the amount of different software that's available for you to use. There's a million different ways to approach coloring. What I'm going to present to you in this video and future video is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. You kind of have to figure out what works for you. Everyone has different techniques, but there are some things that I think are somewhat industry standard that a lot of people use, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. All these apps and software that I mentioned, they also have built-in color palettes that you can choose from. There are also other ways, other places that you can go out. A lot of times I'll go to Pinterest and just look at color schemes and things like that. There are, apps like I think Color Explorer, Color Hunter, all kinds of different apps that you can use to help inform the colors that you use. There's also programs that help you with your lighting and everything. I think there's an app called Handy that's really good with that, where you can move cameras around on a figure and kind of choose where your lighting is and use different gels and things like that. Like we talked about in the reference episode, don't be afraid to look at what other great colors are doing and try to work that back or reverse engineer that and figure out, or just there's tons of other videos online. Like I said, I'll show you some of my coloring process, but there's no shortage of tutorials on coloring. With a little digging, you're going to find some great advice out there. I will try to get you set up, at least point you in the right direction with what some of the techniques that you want to consider when you are approaching colors, so then when you do get into that technical aspect, you'll be a little better prepared for that. One thing that I want to say that you should pay attention to is, even if you're doing a web comic that you probably don't see it ever going to print, I would still work in Cmyk. It's set up for printing. You'll lose out on a little color, some of the brighter colors that you can get with RGB, and you can convert RGB to Cmyk when you do go to print. In Photoshop, I usually start off working in RGB just because it reduces the file size, because it's 3 colors instead of 4. However, in Photoshop, and I don't know some of the other programs, I'm sure they have something similar, but in Photoshop, when you are in your color picker, there is a little icon that'll pop up if it's outside of RGB and it's not safe for Cmyk. It's a little exclamation point. Anytime I see that pop up, I make sure that I don't choose a color like that, even if I am working in RGB. And when I'm finished coloring my piece, working in RGB, knowing that all my colors are also Cmyk safe, I can switch that over to Cmyk before I send that off to the printer. As I mentioned before, when working in Photoshop or a similar program, you've got so many different options, so many different effects, so many different filters. One of them that I tend to use quite a bit is the multiply layer. We'll get into this more in the process, but you can multiply anything that you have, that say, even with your line art, if it's black and white, you can convert that layer to multiply and it will just get rid of anything white so that your colors will show through. We'll get more of that in the process, but the other thing that I usually do with, say, a multiply layer is I'll put a layer on top, make it, you either can be a solid color or a gradient, and multiply that. You can even bring down the opacity a little bit, but that'll give your page, no matter what colors you're using, it'll give a little bit of a tint to it. And when you do that, your colors tend to be a little more harmonious. And working digitally, we have all these different options at our disposal. We can make things look weathered, we can add texture and lens flares, all this kind of stuff, but just be careful. Like every once in a while I'll add a texture or patterns. Sometimes if you got some clothing, you want to add a pattern, and just depending on the style, you can kind of warp that around and make the pattern warp around the clothing rather than just putting a flat pattern on a 3-dimensional object. So there's a lot of things like that you pay attention to. And all these different digital tools, they can help save time and they can be really advantageous, but sometimes they can be a bit of a crutch, and we can use things that we think might make something look better but may not have the best result. I'll show you sort of an example. So for instance, you're doing a space scene. You've got this planet and everything. In this case, let's talk about the planet Earth. Now, sometimes, maybe you don't want to go in and draw all the continents of Earth and all that stuff. So you think, well, this is it's a photo editing program. I can just bring in, a photo of the Earth and just use that. And so this is from JLA versus Avengers, and this is something I see all the time that kind of sticks out to me. I mean, this is a great page illustrated by George Perez, but the colorists, instead of coloring the planet, which these Earths, they just sort of use some photo manipulation, and I don't know, it just stands out. It's almost like if you guys remember, like when Disney, their animated movies, they first started introducing CGI into their 2-dimensional films, and for me it kind of took you out, because you'd have what really looked like 2-dimensional, and then you bring in these 3D elements in it, and it was very jarring. And you see some of those techniques, so just because you can do something, it might not be the right choice. Like anything else, using tools like Photoshop to color your comic are just that. They are tools, and you need to know how to use them properly. And it doesn't matter if you are doing traditional watercolor or acrylic. If you're not skilled in that, then you're going to have some issues, and you have to understand these software programs if you're going to want to use them. Now, we're going to get into traditional media, and I just want to also preface that you can get some of these traditional looks in Photoshop. Airbrush in particular. I used to do a lot of airbrush illustration, you know, traditionally, but I would never go back to that because it is just so much easier to do it digitally, and you can get quite the same effect. And you can get now with the brushes and everything that we have in Photoshop, you can get that watercolor look, you can get that acrylic look, you can do almost anything. In many cases, it's indistinguishable. But I think it's good to understand those traditional techniques to help inform what you're doing if you are doing some of those techniques in a digital platform. So let's talk more about some of these digital coloring techniques. So traditional colors, I mean, you can use pretty much anything that you want to get color on the page to color a comic. And I've got some examples to show you. And some of them go a little further back before coloring comics was the norm on the computer. And some people are still using these traditional techniques, and it's nice to see those nowadays. So let's get into some examples. A traditional medium that I really love, that I would love to see more in comics, is watercolor. This is an older example, but this is Moonshadow by John J. Muth, and this whole comic was done in watercolor, and it's just got a really cool effect. Now, like I said, you can get sort of this effect now with some of the digital techniques, and I mean, it's just something that, especially back in this time, you just didn't see a lot of this. This was back from the 80s, and this is just one book in my collection that I always look back at because it's just, I mean, it's really got this really cool look with this, you know, sort of watercolor technique. And there's some other books that stuck out that just made me want to pick them up just by the colors. This is a comic book that I bought just for the watercolor covers. The interior, I wasn't as crazy about the colors that they were using on the interior, but this is a series from Dark Horse, Droids, and just the watercolor on this, I mean, it just, that drew me in. And I don't even think I've read these stories. They may be good, I'm not sure, but you know, sometimes great art like that, great coloring. Here's another one. This one is really striking with this sort of C-3PO type character with a gun. I mean, that's something you don't see, but look at all these different techniques. And Star Wars, obviously, you know, this is getting close to, I'm sure this is sort of a mixed medium. It's definitely, it looks like there's watercolor in there, but or maybe gouache, which is like an opaque watercolor. So watercolor or gouache, that's one medium. Another one you don't see a lot of, but I've got a few examples here. Color pencils. You can do some really cool stuff with color pencils. This one is interesting because it looks like it's a number. It looks like there might even be some markers. I don't have a lot of marker examples, but it looks like this table was probably done in marker. But this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, you know, this is sort of a tribute to Jack Kirby. So you've got this interesting look where we want it to look like it's drawn. We want it to look like it's popping off the page. So also consider the colors that you use. Is it right for your story? And we'll get a little more into storytelling and how that comes into colors in a little bit. But yeah, I really do like this with the watercolors, the markers. So basically anything that you can get on page. Here's another one. This looks like, actually, this Teen Titans looks like it's probably a combination of maybe, you know, it looks like there's might be some markers in there, some color pencils. So you can mix things up quite a bit. When you're dealing with entertainment properties, you get a lot of acrylic or gouache. You want something that's, you know, reminiscent of those classic movie posters for a title like Stranger Things, where they are trying to capture that sort of 80s look that was popular with like a Drew Struzan and stuff like that. They've got these really nice painted covers. Star Wars, obviously, they want to capture that. So we've got, I'm guessing acrylic, could be acrylic, could be gouache. Sometimes it's hard to tell. A friend of mine, Jeff Lafferty, now this is a modern comic, but he's still, you know, this is he does everything in acrylic, and the whole book is like this. He's illustrated the whole book. It's all fully painted. As I mentioned, airbrush. Nowadays, most airbrush I think people are going to do digitally. Airbrush is one of those techniques that just translates really well to digital. But you know, this is Ken Stacy, who you may remember if you're familiar with Spawn #1. He was the colorist on the cover for that. But awesome airbrush artist, and this is a book that he did also. All this was done, you know, traditional airbrush, which you've got to mask all this stuff off. I mean, sometimes people can do freehand airbrush, but nowadays you can do all that stuff digitally. It's just so much faster. The work that would go into something like this, it would just save so much time to do digitally now. But yeah, airbrush is an awesome look. And of course, one of the masters as far as painted cover, which I believe I'm not sure exactly what medium he uses. I'm sure It's like probably a gouache or a watercolor or acrylic. But Alex Ross, I mean, when you think of painted comic book covers, he's somebody that's still doing just amazing painted comic book pages and covers. But there's so many different mediums that you can choose when working traditionally. You can combine mediums. I mean, it's pretty much the world is your oyster when it comes to coloring. You just have to find what works for you and make sure that it prints properly. We'll get into that on another episode. So now I want to move on from tools, and I want to talk a little bit about style. Now this is where we get into what I was talking about as far as storytelling, because you may think, you know, as a writer you tell stories, as a penciler you tell stories, as an inker obviously you also tell stories. Coloring is no different. A great colorist can add so much to that storytelling with the colors they choose. Just think of cinematography and film. A big part of cinematography is the colors that are chosen, the mood that you're creating, and that is a colorist's job. A good colorist can draw the reader in and direct their eyes to the focal point. For instance, and I showed this example before, but I'm going to show it again because it's like one of the perfect examples. Right here, this scene, this is from Delilah Dirk by Tony Cliff, and here we've got this scene right here. We've got all this it's just this vast landscape. We've got these characters in here, and we were using this fire and this light to draw the reader's eye right to what we want to see. Here's another example too. We've got our main character Delilah Dirk here, and we've got the opening of the door and the light shining on her, and it's just bringing your eye in here. Now with this panel there's really nothing else going on, so even without that you'd probably be drawn into where she is. But in, let's say, a situation where there's other characters, there's other things going on, and even without that, you're still, you immediately, I mean, it's just bam, it's right there. And that is the job of a colorist, to create that mood and create that focal point and direct the reader's eye to exactly what you want them to be focusing on. And a lot of this is accomplished by an understanding of values and contrast, lights and darks. Without an understanding of the principles of value and contrast, light and dark, you're going to get lost. I'll show you an example. Now, back in the 90s when digital coloring first started to become available, people were just, they're pulling out all the stops. I mean, we've got all these cool tools that we can use. Let's use all of them. Colors were just going crazy. I mean, this is Youngblood #1. Look at this. I mean, it's just like a rainbow barfed on the page. You know, I mean, you can't really tell what's going on because it's just a sensory overload. I mean, there's no value at all. It's all of these bright colors. You just totally getting lost. But you know, it's because here, oh, we can make these bright, you know, bold comics now. Let's just do all this stuff, and you just can't really differentiate one thing from another. I mean, all these glares and everything. And I hate to kind of use this as an example, but is it a good example what not to do? Now, I do kind of give them a little bit of a pass just because the time period we're in. Like I said, it's like, oh, we've got all these great tools, and as you see, you know, this is Image Comics when they first started doing this. But now if you look at an Image comic, you're going to get a better understanding of all these principles and what makes something, you know, is pleasant to look at, and not just, like I said, a rainbow that's just been vomited upon the page. Another thing we can accomplish with color is depth. We talked a little bit about atmospheric perspective in other episodes, but here's another pretty good example. We've got our main hero. I don't even really know who she is. It looks like she's part of the Spider Universe, but we've got all these buildings and everything. And then way back in the background, even we see it so far back that we see sort of that curvature of the earth, but you see how it kind of fades away, and that's atmosphere. But even in scenes where we don't have this, you know, massive illusion of depth moving back and forth with this giant cityscape, even if we got something closer, going back to creating that focal point, if we've got a character in the foreground and what's in back, maybe it's not, maybe just a little bit right behind them, if it's not as important, maybe there's some characters back there, we can kind of use, you know, light and contrast to kind of fade that stuff away, put the main focus on our character. If you've ever seen a movie where they play with the focus, or even a photograph where the main subject matter is sharp, and then in contrast in the background we've got things kind of blurred out. In film sometimes they can even switch back, like a rack focus, where what's in the foreground is focused and what's in the background isn't as important, and then they want to move their attention from the main focus to the background. They do that sort of rack focus. You could do the reverse in comics. You'd have to use panel transition, but you switch that lighting to what's in the background instead of the foreground, because it's not always the element that's in the foreground that you want to focus on. You can have that sort of blurred away. I do this technique a lot where I've got like a character in the foreground just to show depth, but it's not as important. Maybe you're looking over that character's shoulder, so maybe they will be in shadow, where as we get further back, there's some light on that subject. And then that's going to draw the reader's eye to what's most important in the background. In order to be a successful colorist, you have to understand color theory. Now, I'm not going to get into all the elements of color theory, but there's some basics that you have to know, and that all starts with the color wheel. Here we've got our color wheel, and I don't know if there's a right side up or not. I don't think so, but anyway. So right up here, our blues, our greens, our purples, those are our cool colors. Down here with the oranges and reds, just think of a flame, other than, like, obviously there's blue flames and stuff, but usually when you think of a flame, those colors are going to be your warm colors, and these are going to be your cool colors. Now, colors that are closer to each other, like right here, those would be your analogous colors. One of the techniques that I use is I usually try to stick to, you know, analogous colors, whether it's a cool color scheme or warm color scheme, and then if I want something to pop, then I will pick something in the opposite. Maybe it's all cool colors, like a night sky, like kind of like the example I showed with the fire, and then have a little fire here. Using your complementary colors or your contrasting colors just to kind of pop something out. So as I said, colors that are next to each other are analogous colors. Colors that are on the opposite ends, those are your contrasting colors or your complementary colors. I know that sounds kind of, they don't sound like this. Complementary and contrasting sounds like totally different things, but it's pretty much the same thing. So for instance, like a green and a red, here's a great example. I showed this one before, but I'm going to show it again because it has to do with color. But this is an Oblivion song cover, and just look how striking that is with the green against the red. One you see a lot on like movie posters in particular are going to be the blues and the oranges. Those, I mean, you see that all the time. It's probably my favorite, you know, contrasting color scheme. But another one is like say the yellows and the purples. Here's another brilliant example of that. We've got this yellow against purple, and then we get a little more into the orange and everything. So we got some of those analogous colors, the orange and the yellow as well. But for the most part, we've got some really nice complementary or contrasting colors here. And you can use these different color schemes to create different moods in your story. Here's a good example. This is Frank Miller's Ronin, and if you flip through this, you're going to see as the story progresses and we go from different scenes, we've got different color schemes. Now here is a relatively cool color scheme, a lot of blues, a lot of greens. Very next page, bam, we've switched it. Now we're working with really warm colors. So as your story progresses, when you move from a scene to scene, sometimes it helps to use different color schemes to show transition or just different locations. Sometimes we can go with a very limited color palette, and I'm a big fan of this. This is Blood Realm. This is an alternate title. I really dig this, but so it's basically, even from the cover, it's basically three colors. It's black and white and then red. Here we could have just, the artist could have just done this all in black and white, but they've chosen just little red, and it works really well because, I mean, even the title of the book is Blood Realm. Here's another alternate title. This is the 12 or the XII if you want to type that in into your Google search. But this whole book has a very limited color palette. Now this could have been just as easily done, like I said, with grayscale, but instead of grayscale, we've got this really sort of, you know, very warm colors. And this is it's almost like, you know, this is almost like what a cinematographer would do, you know, somebody like a Zack Snyder who mutes all this stuff, but something like this where it is a post-apocalyptic world. I mean, it creates a really nice look to it. Now, back when I showed this example of this Youngblood comic where you just got all these super bright hues, and hue can be best described, I guess, as sort of this unsaturated, the purest sense of a color, like the colors you would see in a rainbow before you start adding, you know, tints and shades and tones to them. But here's a good example of, you know, a comic that uses these bright hues, but it's still very effective because in the Youngblood example, here we're sticking to, again, mostly a really cool color palette. This is Feast or Famine and other alternate titles. You'll see I have a lot of these. But the other thing I like about this is because even though it's printed on newsprint, I mean, they're getting these really, really impressive colors just to go to show you that you can print really nice stuff on these newsprints. But what I like about this is it's sort of in this sort of space, off-worldy, you know, setting, and just these bright colors. And we do start getting some of these pinks and these really vibrant colors, but it's not done in a way that is distracting. When I open this, I mean, that stuff kind of blows me away. I mean, I just love the color scheme in this particular comic. And it's a really good example of style and fitting the right color scheme to the right story. This particular color scheme, as much as I love it, it's not going to work in a comic like the 12 that I showed, where it's that post-apocalyptic muted color scheme. So know what the story is about before you decide on your color palettes, and take that into consideration. And not all stories need these really vibrant colors, a lot of shading, and sort of that airbrush look. A comic like this, another alternative title, Psycho KO, it's kind of harkening to sort of a look of like a, you know, an animated cartoon. So we've got these flat, almost like cell shaded look, and this works perfect for this particular book. And you can take a flat cell shaded look all the way to that really, you know, highly polished airbrush look, or anything in between. Here, this is a book, it's Gumshoes for Hire. This is Sean Galloway Cheeks. Right here you can see another, this has got a very animated look to it. There's very stark shadows here. It's not really that airbrush look, but it does have a very sort of vibrant look to it as well. And the reason I picked this particular book, because it's got some really good examples, because he starts off with these very flat colors, and then he adds these shades of black or tints of gray, and it's not even really gray. And that's what I like about the technique that he uses. And he may even, it looks like he even starts with his tones, these gray tones, but they're not really gray. If you look, he uses a purple, which is sort of in between. It's a little more cool. It's not as gray, because the problem is when you start introducing shades or adding black to your colors, it can start to get muted. Same thing if you're adding tints or adding whites to your colors, it can get a little washed out. So I always, you know, I usually use tones of other colors. For instance, you know, if I'm doing like, you know, if I've got like a blue, I'm not going to go and just add black. I'm going to sort of use a darker blue and add that sort of tint. But what he does is he's using, and I would again recommend using sort of a purple, because it's sort of a middle ground. It's not going to get as muddy as if you were just using straight gray. It's got a little bit of a color, and because purple is a combination of, you know, red, which is a warm color, and blue, which is a cool color, it's very neutral, and it's a good way to do that. He's basically created all his different tones here first, and then he can just drop solid colors, and then this is the result. It's basically just solid colors with those tones on top, and it's got a really good look to it. Great colors can expand and improve on even the line art that was provided by the penciler and the inker. This is a great example of color holds, which is a technique that a lot of colorists use. This is a Howling Commandos book here, and if you look right here, we've got this flashlight popping up with all these different characters in here. Now these were drawn, I'm pretty sure, just in black and white line art, but to create that effect, the artist has gone in there, the colorist rather, has gone in there and sort of changed all the black and white line art to like more of an orange solid color, which gives a really great effect. And that technique is called color holds. A lot of times you can use that with like anytime somebody's like shooting like energy blasts or whatever, because it kind of fades it away. It makes it so it's not as stark. But it doesn't just have to be a lighting thing. Like if you've looked at any of my illustrations outside of comic books, I use that technique a lot, where, and you see this sometimes in like Disney films, where whatever the color, the main color is, the outline will kind of be a darker version of that color. I like that look a lot. I use it all the time. But you know, that's all done with color holsters, all these different techniques. But going back to kind of what I was saying before, use them sparingly. If you use too many of these color holds, it's not going to look right. If you're using them on all the characters and everything, it probably won't have the same effect as it does this, because it's a particular instance, there's a reason for it, and the colorist has thought this out. So going into coloring, if you want to be a colorist, there's a lot of things to think about. And like I said, we will go into a little more in depth on some of the actual processes of setting things up, flatting, all that stuff in a bonus issue. But that's pretty much all I got to talk about today as far as coloring. Hope that helps out. Hopefully it's not too much information for you because there's a lot to think about. But with any of these videos, you got to dive a little deeper and you learn more. And there's other videos online that you can search out and you can learn more about comic book coloring. And but that's all I got to say for today. I will see you guys later, and that is all. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Also, you can follow me at Serkworks on social media, and now you can support the work that I do on Patreon. Do you like making comics? Then go to Serkworks.com and pick up the Comic Maker Starter Kit. It's packed full of fonts, brushes, templates, and more. And best of all, it's totally free.